My name is Shmuel Feiner. I was asked in very short notice to replace Professor Shulamit Volkov, who couldn't come to the conference today. So I'm not going to be an active chair, just to, to fulfill the formal task of presenting the speakers. So the title of the session is First Encounters, Motivations, Dilemmas, and Atmosphere. And I must say that the question of motivations is really important to me personally. I tried to raise this several times in seminars with students and colleagues in Germany, and the major reaction was usually embarrassment, if not silence. So after a few times, I understood that I should stop with this bad behavior, because this is not a polite issue to raise in Germany. But maybe today we are more open, and maybe this is the right forum to discuss this issue of motivation. So we are having here two participants in this session. Each of them is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we are going to have a discussion. And let me present the first speaker, Dr. Nicolas Berg. He's a guest professor at the Fritz Bauer Institute, Frankfurt. Previously, he was chief research associate at the Simon-Dubnow-Institute for Jewish History and Culture in Leipzig. Nicolas Berg studied history, German language and literature, and Slavic studies at the University of Freiburg. He received his PhD in 2001, and the topic of his thesis was, as we can now learn from the title of his newly published, I think, a book in English, The Holocaust and the West German Historians, Historical Interpretations and Autobiographical Memory, that was published by Madison, Wisconsin University Press just recently. And the title of his talk today, The Jerusalem Question, The Memories of a German Visitor to Israel in 1959. Please, Nicolas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shmuel Feiner, for the nice introduction. Dear Ifat, dear Raphael, and dear Gabriel Motzkin, thank you so much including me in this fascinating conference of today. I start with a short quotation from 1966. For the individuals, there are renewed connections. For the new historical entities, only diplomatic relations, unquote. It was Rudolf Leonard, the theologian and educational scholar from Berlin, known today only to a few specialists, who expressed that in aphoristic form in an essay in German titled On the Life of the German Language in Jerusalem, published in the journal Die Sammlung, launched by Hermann Nohl in Göttingen. As if in a fixed formulation, we see here conceived as diametrical opposed events or processes, communication between states as diplomacy on the one hand, and the encounter between human beings on the other. Perhaps also, if we expand this tersely formulated thought, diplomatic procedure may be conceived and engaged in by persons, but it always remains something essentially different from the actual dialogue between two individuals, and should not be mistakenly confused with that. In textbooks, the history of ideas is often presented as something orderly. Theses are followed by antitheses. One epoch connects with the other. Books and ideas find their readers in a magical way and thus exert their impact. But in reality, as a rule, the history of ideas generates obscure meanings, semantic linkages and entanglements difficult to decode. Yet sometimes the history of ideas before it passes into the textbooks condense in a universal moment into a real happening, so to speak, that stands before the observer, looking back in time like a veritable work of art. We can describe these moments, without doing them any violence, as primal scenes for an entire thematic or framing of a problem. And I would like today, for the theme of our conference on the humanities between Germany and Israel, to present and explore such a primal scene. Its historical locus lay precisely in the middle ground between state diplomacy and human encounter. It consists of the visit of a German in the private home of a Jerusalem scholar in 1959. In the choreography and self-interpretation of this visit, we can discern elements of diplomatic and direct discourse. In the available documents, both aspects emerge into clarity in the scene, an insurmountable element of distance on the basis of the bitter legacy of the antipodal events and experiences in the Nazi years, and the given belonging to the German and Jewish collective, previously split asunder. And this notwithstanding, likewise, a genuine one-to-one human encounter. Tangible are the redundancy of the one-sided attempt at reviving past traditions and the short flickering of a new beginning. Both became visible, the indomitable longing for impartiality and the mediated insight that after what had transpired, this cannot be demanded of an interlocutor. It is about these compactions that I want to speak today. I call this scene the Jerusalem question, and it's introduced by one of the two men directly involved in the following description, a quote which I would like to present you in full length in two parts. And I quote part one. Jerusalem, an Arab house inside the study of a German professor, Martin Buber. I am sitting across from him, a bit apprehensive. He's more than double my age. But is that the cause of my anxiety? This is how I once sat with Friedrich Meinecke shortly after the war as his student in Berlin-Dahlem. That study room back then in 1946 was similar to this one here, 1959 in Jerusalem. Just like the old pictures of the study corners of Wilhelm von Humboldt and Goethe resemble one to the other. The quiet here, the simplicity, the gravity of the bookshelves, these desks and solid chairs in the room of a German professor in the 19th century were infused with the Geist of German idealism, of German classicism. This is how it also looked inside the study of Eduard Spranger, Nikolai Hartmann. That is how I encountered Karl Jaspers in Bâle. And yes, even Werner Jäger in Harvard. A hint in the air of Prussianism and idealism, a kind of stern comfort watched over by the professor's wife, the restful view from the window. Tables strewn with papers, the modest lamp. This privatism of German science, it started with Kant and came to an end with the great German professors of our century. So here was Martin Buber in his German study in Israel, with me sitting before the dark eye of the old man, end quote. With this description in 1959, the then well-known journalist and television director Thilo Koch began his report about his visit in Israel at the home of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. Koch, born 1920 in Halle Saale, was in his late 30s when he traveled to Israel. His interlocutor Buber was already over 80. The young visitor from the Federal Republic belonged to the founding generation of radio and TV journalism in the young Federal Republic. Koch was later lauded as the Grand Master of journalism, man of the first hour, and, quote, one of the great TV pioneers. He was, for example, the founder of the ARD weekly news feature Weltspiegel, which still exists, and became known to the West German public in the early 1960s, especially as a correspondent reporting from Washington. His name remains associated with the first live transmission in German state TV in 1963 of the funeral of President John F. Kennedy. Koch's description, cited here at length, of his entry into the private study of the Jewish philosopher in Jerusalem is to a great exemplary degree readable. In a striking way, it brings together the signature of the history of memory of those late 1950s. The locus of this conversation is symbolic and appears here as the pilgrim's destination for a confession, imbued with the emphatic moral tenor of the visitor and the stylized fatherly kindness and genuine reserve of his host. Exemplary, likewise, are the details as well. The very telling mention for the constellation of this discourse of shame, of the visitor's apprehensiveness facing the dark eye of the old man, and reference constructing a parallel to the year 1946 and the historian Friedrich Meinecke, where the two studies in Berlin-Dahlem and Jerusalem are conjured up distinctively as a shared world of culture. Thus, the trip to the study of the teacher becomes a rhetorical act, the bringing of Buber back home into the pantheon of the German intellect, to Kant, Humboldt, and Goethe. This form of an intellectual indemnification by Koch becomes discernible as self-conciliation, as the transfiguration of German idealism and German classicism as eternal values, values that had manifestly remained uncast by the Nazi years and the crimes of the Germans. Evident in these lines Koch wrote is the obvious longing for a Germany somehow unsoiled, which the visitor rediscovers in distant Jerusalem after it had been de facto destroyed in Germany. Thus, the ostensible compliment becomes the rescue of one's own heritage, into which Buber is transposed, and certainly with good arguments, but also interlarged with a whole series of less good ones. In a short newspaper report that deals directly with his visit to Israel, Koch expressed this in a more pointed manner when he advanced the thesis typical for the 1950s that the best, quote, indemnification of the intellect, the Geist, would be to point up what once constitute the nexus between Germanness and the Jews, Deutschtum and Judentum. Here too, he also speaks of the affinity between Germans and Jews, quote, which actually gave birth to our modern world, which with all its premises and horrors, end quote. This strict, consistent parallelization of Einstein, Freud, and Kafka on the one hand, and Kant, Humboldt, and Goethe on the other, makes clear the cognitive operation Koch seeks to employ here in harmony with his time. And I present you the second part of the quotation from this text now. Slowly, the oppressive uncertainty fades away. I notice that the philosopher is also striving to see initially the person in me, the German. I don't have answers to any general questions. What do you yourself want to ask me now? Buber said. But it is the great general question that have led me to him. There is a monstrous question between the Germans and the Jews. How was it possible? How was it possible for and by us? End quote. Buber is in this text to have replied, and I finish the quotation, "That's a German question, not ours. I learn here with Buber," Koch said, "that moral, intellectual indemnification is a far broader field than material reparations," unquote. Koch speaks here with good intentions about the relation between Germans and Jews after the Holocaust, but his Jerusalem question was a German question. And the answer he brought back from there to Germany served him as a kind of exoneration. But he didn't receive that answer from Buber, who had only returned his question and had avoided any sentence about the intellectual affinity between Germans and Jews. The fantasy on the part of the German journalist of obtaining the answer to the monstrous question from a Jewish philosopher after the mass murder of the Jews by the Germans makes one key aspect very clear, namely that an intellectual and political confrontation by the Germans with the crimes was undertaken on a condition, in a way that this gesture might furnish catharsis and strengthen the conviction that actually there are more shared than separating experiences, and that the return on this ostensible investment of commonality could be paid off by the avowal of the shared intellectual heritage. Thilo Koch made his visit to put together a TV interview that was aired in the evening of 25th of May 1959 by West German State Television in the feature series Aus erster Hand. But Koch did not only make a TV interview out of this meeting with Buber. He also developed the idea of a radio feature series, and then using that series went on to put together a collective volume on the canon of German Jewish intellectual history. It was published in 1961 and reissued once again in the 1990s and reprinted in 2002. As editor of this anthology, Koch no longer presented the 12 portraits in German Jewish intellectual history as a question, but rather as a fact. His thesis was so general that he remained unanswerable, yet appeared quite exalted. His topic there was, again, the Jews and the German intellect, stressing the quote-unquote special affinity between the two. The guiding conception of the book as a whole was intended to be more than, I quote, anti-Semitism, as Koch put it, and it was representative of the whole ambivalence of those philosemitic attempts at reflection in the realms of the fundamental that were so numerous in the 1950s. Central in this discourse were the Germans, not the Jews, and an invocation of the intellectual affinity between the two, a bit to salvage one's own tradition. As the telling hope of the editor put it in vividly evoking the lasting values of German Jewish history, I quote, "Our attempt in presenting Jewish German intellectual history aims to leave aside for once this field of controversy about the truth of those 12 years, unquote. What he was referring to were the 12 years of Hitler's reign, which he explicitly had to exclude in order to be able to allow to speak about the topic at all. Koch also commented there about his actual motivation for the book and about himself. I quote, "I wish to find authors of non-Jewish origin, and if possible, they should belong to my generation, the generation of World War II, which was made culpable and which desires an accounting. So I come to a conclusion. The telling details were not enough. Central was more the demand for an accounting by a generation that passively was made culpable. Less important was history and his victims. Seen against this backdrop, the journey to Jerusalem takes on a different meaning. The 12 years are, to be sure, the point of departure for the question of why, but are not the actual reason for the hoped-for answer, because the German journalist had already brought along that answer to Israel in 1959. It was only scantily cloaked in the hope of receiving the Jewish blessing for the intellectual similarity and affinity between what was German and what was Jewish. In the book, by the way, Alexander Mitscherlich wrote a chapter on Freud, Walter Kiaulén, on Berlin Jewish criticism, Walter Jens wrote on Kafka, Jürgen Habermas on Jewish philosophers, Heinrich Böll on Karl Marx. Paul Schalück, for example, makes clear that during the weeks and months he worked on his essay on Moses Mendelssohn, he had to think back, quote, more than otherwise to the most shameful era of our people and the extermination of the Jews. He noted that since 1946, and this is important now, when he was released from captivity and had returned to a country in ruins, he had been thinking about a new understanding of suffering, and that today he was convinced that between Germans and Jews there was, quote, a symbiosis of experience of suffering, of different kinds, of course. And Rudolf Hagelstange enthusiastically cited the letter of reconciliation that Mathilde Rathenau, the mother of the murdered foreign minister, had written to the mother of one of the murderers of her son. I quote, "Tell your son that I forgive him in the name and the spirit of the victim," unquote. To finish with a question, is this then at all an example for German-Israeli scientific cooperation in the humanities? At the same time, yes and no. Yes, because the journey did take place. The meeting in Jerusalem is recorded history. It concerned fundamental questions that are preliminary to formally drawn up and informal cooperations in academic formats, and which shaped and continue to shape such cooperations over years and decades. No, because the German visitor here brought along German expectations which did not need a Jerusalem answer. Thank you very much.